I was actually part of the American Psychological Association task force on the racism apology and resolution, and our task force consulted with APA to write that apology. So that was very significant. Thank you for acknowledging that. Also, you mentioned the late Dr. Richard Gorsuch, who became a faculty member here while I was at Fuller, and he was, I think, a friend and an ally of Asian Americans. He consulted with me quite a bit on my research while I was at Fuller, and afterwards I would call him up, and he was just very brilliant and gave lots of free advice to me as I was starting my academic career. And he was also the advisor to my good friend, Dr. Jay Uemoto, who is now back in the Seattle area, but is a very prominent rehab psychologist. So Dr. Gorsuch really was certainly an ally, and despite who his advisor was, he certainly was an advocate for racial and social justice. So let me get a couple things out of the way. You're looking at me and you're thinking, what's this guy doing here on API Heritage Month? Well, my great-grandfather was a Methodist minister in Japan, and my grandmother and grandfather came to California in the early 1900s. My father was white, so similar to my granddaughter, I'm half Japan, so that's why I look like I do. And I'm also old, so I'm so old that when I was here at Fuller, there was no history of psychology course. So, okay, so this is a picture of me, 1977, right before I came to Fuller, and I had a lot of hair then, and as my 6-year-old granddaughter says when she sees these pictures of me with hair, she says, "Ji-chan, tell me what happened." And so what happened is that I got old and lost my hair, but I came to Fuller. I was very excited to be here and felt very privileged to be able to get the training I got here. So this is Poston, Arizona, where my mother was in World War II from 1942 to 44. She and her family were taken to Poston, were incarcerated there because they were Japanese Americans. And that was a sad period of her life. And for many Japanese Americans, there was an effort to try to hide this and move on and not talk about this. My mother, on the other hand, actually talked with me about this and gave me a sense of who I was as a Japanese American. So a sad part of our history, but an important part, and an event that helped me understand my identity as a Japanese and Asian American. This is the inside of the Japanese Presbyterian Church. This was my family's church. I see Melanie Mar-Chow there. Melanie was part of this church as well. And this is a place where I learned a lot about my faith and integrating my faith with social justice. Our pastor there, Reverend Richard Nishioka, was active in the Japanese American redress movement in the early 1980s, and he served as a role model of integrating faith and activism and racial and social justice. And a couple of my friends from this church, Jay Uemoto, who I've already mentioned, and Steve Okiyama, followed me to Fuller and got their PhDs in clinical psychology. And there have been many others from this church, Melanie included, who've come to Fuller, but this was a formative place for me during my early years in Seattle. And 77, 81, I was here at Fuller Seminary, got my PhD. My advisor was the late Newton Maloney, who was very supportive of my work and helped me get through a challenging period of my life. And getting my PhD at Fuller was the second best thing that happened to me during that period, because I married my wife, Jeannie, in 1979. So I count that as number one, and number two was getting a PhD at Fuller. Not that it wasn't important, but being married was really important. So I'm going to be discussing Asian American mental health disparities. So who are Asian Americans? Asian Americans constitute 22 million people, roots in more than 20 countries, and 60% of those who are Asian Americans were born in Asia. So this was a complete change from before 1965. So before 1965, about 2/3 of Asian Americans were born in the United States. Since the immigration laws changed in 1965, the reverse has happened. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders constitute about 7% of the population. And in LA County, they're almost 12%. So a large growing population that warrants attention. These are studies of mental health service utilization in a meta-analysis by Smith and Trimble from the 1970s through 2008. 2008 is a while ago, but these trends haven't changed. So this is lifetime use, any lifetime use of mental health services, and you can see that Asian Americans are the least likely group to have used mental health services during their lifetime. All the other groups are higher and much higher. Whites are almost 1 in 4. Asian Americans are about 12 or 13%. This is any mental health service utilization during one's lifetime. This is a disparity that has persisted since it was first identified in the 70s until now. So although the data ended here in 2008, there hasn't been an appreciable difference in the 16 years since 2008. This is my colleague Nolan Zane, and one of the reasons that mental health disparities exist is that many Asian Americans have face concerns. So face is one's social reputation based on traits, attitudes, and values that one presents to others, and face is saved by fulfilling one's roles as a member of a group, one's family, one's school, one's work. So if one is a good family member, or is a good son or daughter, or is a good parent, or is a good student, or a good teacher, or a good worker supervisor, that's how one saves face. And any instance in which one might lose face is to be avoided. And so if one has mental health problems, that may interfere with their functioning, and it creates a great potential for loss of face. And it's loss of face not only for the individual, but for one's family or one's colleagues or one's classmates. So if I'm having problems, that means that somebody's not taking care of me, and that implicates those in my social group as well. Mental illness prevents a person from saving face by fulfilling their roles, family, work, school. And face concerns, first of all, prevent a disclosure of symptoms. So if I'm having some problems, I'm not going to tell someone else, because that might burden them. And it might burden them and also suggest that they're not taking care of me. We're supposed to be interdependent. If I'm having problems, that means that's kind of a criticism of you. If you're part of my family, you're part of my social network. And of course, if you're not going to disclose problems, that can prevent you from seeking help. So I want to talk about cultural adaptations of psychotherapy to address some of these mental health disparities. So in an American Psychologist article I wrote with many of my colleagues, we talked about three levels of consideration. And we also talked about precision medicine, which integrates all three of these levels. So the universal level is where most psychotherapy and interventions are focused. And this is on the social context. The evidence-based work that we have assumes that the healing principles are universal and don't need to be adapted or customized for any particular group. The group level, on the other hand, focuses strongly on cultural context and focuses on the external validity of an intervention. So universal approaches focus on internal validity, what can be done in the lab. Group interventions focus on external validity. How does this apply? How does this work in an actual community, in a cultural context? And the individual level is a personal context and how applicable these universal principles and group principles are to the individual. So if I'm an immigrant Asian American, how applicable are these general principles to me? And if they're culturally adapted, how applicable is that cultural adaptation to me? So I may be a Chinese American, but I may or may not be connected to my culture. If I'm very acculturated, maybe some of the universal principles are going to apply to me. But even if I'm not acculturated, there is something about growing up in a Chinese family and context that makes me a little bit different than everybody else. But I'm not exactly the same as all other Chinese Americans. So what is it about me as an individual that is unique? So that's where precision medicine comes in, integrating the universal, the group, and individual considerations. This is a picture of Fred Leong, and Fred has contended that using any one of the three dimensions in a unidimensional fashion has limited validity in psychotherapy. So I think the limitations of existing approaches is that the universal approach, the evidence-based approach, is not considered cultural context. The cultural adaptations approach has been certainly a big improvement, but that also has not considered individual variation. And just treating people as individuals leaves out the cultural and universal context. So Fred has advocated that all three levels be integrated. So the evidence-based treatments movement occurred in the 1990s, and evidence-based treatments are the integration of best research evidence with clinical expertise and patient values. So there was an effort to incorporate patient values. And as I mentioned, these evidence-based approaches have been assumed to be universally applicable. But the evidence base for these EBTs is primarily for one group, namely whites. So although this sounds noble to integrate clinical evidence with patient values, the patient values that were being considered were not from diverse patient groups. So this inattention to culture in EBTs is based on the argument that there's no evidence that non-adapted interventions are ineffective with diverse groups. The diverse groups weren't examined in these evidence-based practice studies, but the assumption was that these evidence-based approaches would work with other groups without actually having evidence whether they did or not work. So this is a lowest common denominator of care versus a highest standard of care. So if it works, that's good enough, rather than thinking about how can we make these treatments better. And evidence-based treatments have not reduced mental health disparities. So those mental health disparities, mental health utilization disparities that you saw in that graph from the Smith and Trimble meta-analysis, those persisted through the 1990s and beyond after the advent of evidence-based treatments. In the 1990s and 2000s, the culturally adapted treatments movement took off. And there's two major types of cultural adaptation. One is what I call therapist adaptations. And one example of therapist adaptations is client-therapist ethnic matching. The assumption is that if a client and therapist share the same ethnicity, that the treatment outcome will be better because the therapist and client share culture, share some identity. Actually, my dissertation in 1982 focused on client-therapist ethnic matching as a component. Another component of therapist adaptations is therapist cultural competence. So the idea is that most therapists that see clients of color aren't going to be people of color, or you're not always going to be able to have a cultural match, an ethnic match, but perhaps we can have a cultural match by making therapists culturally competent. And then another major area of cultural adaptations is therapy adaptations. So tailoring therapy content to the client to make it optimally effective for a particular client. Client-therapist ethnic match across studies may inexactly represent something else. It could mean a language match, and that's very important. If the client and therapist are from a certain ethnic group and and English is not their first language and they can speak the same language, that is an important factor in communication. Secondly, client-therapist ethnic match may be a proxy for cultural competence. So if therapist and client are from the same ethnic group, that therapist may know something about that client's ethnic group. But that match is inexact because not all therapists from an ethnic group know everything about that ethnic group, and not all therapists from a certain ethnic group can speak a language. So I took Japanese 101 about 20 years ago when my kids were in Japanese immersion school. My Japanese is very, very limited, even though I'm ethnically Japanese American. What client-therapist ethnic match may do is prevent premature termination. So if a client comes to a session, they see a therapist that looks like them, they may give that therapist the benefit of the doubt. Whereas if the therapist doesn't look like them, they may be skeptical and may drop out after one session. So clients need to attend a certain number of sessions to have a therapeutic dosage. So one benefit of a client-therapist ethnic match is that that may keep a client in therapy. Unfortunately, client-therapist ethnic match has very limited effects on therapy outcome or improvement. So deeper components such as cultural adaptations of the treatment may actually affect outcomes. So client-therapist ethnic match has some limited benefits. Cultural competence is another area that it has been popular actually in psychology. This is Joyce Chu, and she and her colleagues talked about the classic components of cultural competence: cultural awareness, awareness of one's personal values, awareness of one's personal biases, knowledge of a client's cultural background and worldview, knowledge of the client's therapy expectations, and a skills component to be able to provide culturally relevant and sensitive treatment. So that's basically the components of cultural competence. So let me ask you something. What do you think the effects of cultural competence are on treatment outcomes? So if a therapist is culturally competent or considers themselves culturally competent, how might that affect treatment outcome? Anybody, just you can raise your hand, speak loud, or come to the mic. How might cultural competence affect treatment outcome? And Fuller may do this. Many graduate programs do this. Cultural competence training has, been something that's very much emphasized in psychological training programs. So graduate training programs. So how might what might be the effect of cultural competence? okay, the client feels heard and understood. I mean, that would be the hope. So the effects of cultural competence across studies are that the therapist's perceptions of their own cultural competence are not associated with their client's experiences in therapy. So people get cultural competence training. They feel like, oh, I've arrived. I'm culturally competent. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the client perceives them as culturally competent. Clients' perceptions of therapist cultural competence are actually associated with participation in therapy, but they're mildly associated with treatment outcomes. So cultural competence is important, but it's not the be-all, end-all. Therapy content cultural adaptations involve the modification of an evidence-based treatment to consider multiple factors, language, culture, context, in such a way that is compatible with the client's cultural patterns, meanings, and values. This is Guillermo Bernal, who's been one of the leaders in the cultural adaptations movement. And this is a graph of many studies. It's a meta-analysis that I did with colleagues in 2016. And culturally adapted treatments are about 2/3 of a standard deviation more effective than either no treatment or an alternative treatment or the same form of the treatment that's culturally unadapted. So these were 78 studies, and there are almost 14,000 participants in these studies. So cultural adaptations work. That's the take home from this meta-analysis. But culturally adapted treatments have not reduced mental health disparities. Part of this is the limited availability of culturally adapted treatments. The culturally adapted treatments are expensive in terms of training, and they're complex, and they take a lot of effort. And Guillermo Bernal is a good friend of mine, but he has all of these, I think there's 9 dimensions on which a person culturally adapts, and it's kind of complicated. And this takes me back to something in the 1970s. So there's this church retreat center called Canyon Meadows north of town. And I was a college student then. And it was free time, recreation time. And the person in charge was named Mitchell, and I won't give you his last name, although someone might know who he is. He's still around. But Mitchell was in charge of the pool recreation. So he's standing there by the pool. It was August. We're all hot. We're ready to get into the pool. So Mitchell has this clipboard, and he's going through all of these instructions about what we're going to do in this relay, and he's reading. And it took him several minutes to read these instructions. And finally, people just pushed him in the water, and that was the end of it. So that's a little bit like some of these cultural adaptations. There's so many rules, there's so much complexity that people just kind of give up. Now, that's not to say that cultural adaptations shouldn't be taken seriously and that they are complex and that someone should not approach this superficially. But I think some people, many people don't engage in cultural adaptations because they are too complex. Cultural adaptations are also broadly applied to address cultural features that are associated with a particular group. So my good friend Wei-Chin Wong, who's at Claremont, has this very elegant cultural adaptation of psychotherapy for Chinese Americans. He's one of my colleagues. We've co-authored papers together. He's on this American Psychologist paper. But I had a Chinese American grad student a few years ago who read his paper. Her parents are from Taiwan, and she's reading his paper that was for Chinese Americans, and she's saying, well, a lot of this doesn't apply to me. Some of it does, some of it does. I don't understand some of this. I mean, and she's Chinese American. So the problem here is that these culturally adapted treatments have been broadly applied to a group similar to the universal approaches. The assumption is that everyone is interchangeable. And even though these culturally adapted approaches have been designed for people in particular cultural groups, the tendency is to treat the whole group as being similar or interchangeable. And the individual diversity within a group, such as acculturation, is often not a part of the cultural adaptation. So now I want to turn to the personal relevance approach that we developed in 2021, and this is how meaningful and useful an intervention is to a given person. We want to know whether the treatment approach being used is seen as credible and matches clients' belief systems and perceptions of what would be beneficial to them. So does this treatment approach fit this particular individual? So I want to give you a case study of a 13-year-old Chinese-American immigrant, and I'll call him John. And this is something that occurred long ago and kind of formed some of my thinking. And this is a client that I saw actually when I was here at Fuller, and this is at Chinatown Service Center. Chinatown Service Center was mentioned as a sponsor earlier. So this was when I was a grad student at Fuller, and I was seeing this client at Chinatown Service Center. So John was sent to juvenile hall for stealing school supplies, and he was referred to Chinatown Service Center. When I saw him, he was very embarrassed, remorseful. He didn't want to talk about his problems. And so the therapy, what I tried to do was to focus on his decision-making, but he really basically didn't want to talk. And what would you do? So you have this 13-year-old, he's been referred from juvenile hall to see you. You're trying to think about his thought process, his decision-making process, and you don't want to talk. So what would you do? How would you engage this 13-year-old young man? This audience participation. If people are online, I can't see you, so you can just follow along. So what would you do with a 13-year-old referred for stealing school supplies and is not willing to talk to you as a therapist? Yeah, go ahead. So speak loud because I can't hear. Okay, maybe you heard this talk before. So that's actually what we did. It's that we started playing chess at the end of each session. This was serendipitous. It's not like I thought, oh, we're going to play chess. As a means of problem solving. There happened to be a chess set in the center. He was interested in playing chess. He wasn't really good at chess. I'm not great myself, but we would play chess, and it got him engaged. And little by little, his chess skills actually improved. And so chess became a metaphor of his life. And so he realized, and I wasn't trying to tell him that chess is like your life, or I really was just trying to get him engaged and really wasn't thinking beyond what we were doing in terms of playing chess. But he realized that being mindful of his chess moves was similar to being mindful of life decisions. And in fact, he said to me, hey, you should use chess as a therapy method. So maybe he's a therapist somewhere and today, but that is actually what we did. And so playing chess was relevant to him. And it was an early problem-solving approach. The problem-solving therapy approaches were being developed at that time. They weren't widely available. But playing chess allowed this client to save face by indirectly addressing his problems. He didn't want to talk about his problems, but playing chess and making mistakes and correcting mistakes became a metaphor for his actual life. So more on the personal relevance of psychotherapy. So the idea here is precision medicine, finding what's appropriate for a particular individual given their cultural and social context. And Stanley Su and Nolan Zane have this classic American psychologist paper in 1987, and they discuss credibility and giving. So credibility involves whether the treatment is perceived by the client as beneficial, And then giving is the treatment perceived by the client as practical? Does the therapist give an immediate practical gift to the client? And the gift might be symptom relief or reassurance. So in many Asian American and Asian traditions, there's traditions of gift giving, or in Japanese it's called omiyage. And when you go to someone's house, you bring a gift. It might be food or something to drink, or you bring, or a housewarming gift. It's something that people have come to expect, and you reciprocate. And so similarly, if a client is going to a therapist and they have a gift-giving tradition, or they have a medical model where they go to a doctor and expect some immediate treatment or immediate relief, they want some kind of relief, symptom relief, or reassurance that things are going to be better. If you tell them, well, okay, go home and monitor your thoughts and feelings, that may not be seen as something that is a gift or providing some kind of relief. That might be seen as delaying something, and some people, some clients, some Asian American clients are going to say, well, wait a minute, I've been thinking too much, I've been feeling too much. If I go and think about my feelings and thoughts, that's going to make it worse. So clients need some kind of immediate symptom relief and reassurance that things are going to get better. It's a symbolic gift. There's this red box here. I've talked to psychiatrists about this, and this psychiatrist raises his hand at the end of the session. He says, well, I'm not sure we should actually give gifts to our clients. It's a symbolic gift, not giving a gift in a red box. Jin Kim, who's pictured here with my colleague Nolan Zane, has done work on the credibility of therapy. And as we've reviewed, Asian Americans are the least likely ethnic group to seek mental health services. Relative to white Americans, Asian Americans view therapy as less credible and have lower intentions to seek help. And as you might guess, credibility and help-seeking intentions are correlated. So if treatments are not seen as credible, you're not going to seek that type of treatment. Available treatments are seen as developed for someone other than for me. I may not want to go into therapy because that may not be personally relevant to me. So personally relevant psychotherapy focuses on personal issues such as personal issues. Solving external problems can save face and provide a practical gift. So if you're doing something that helps a person solve their problems with family, school, and work, that is going to provide some motivation and optimism and reassurance that things will get better. If you can provide some practical problem solving in the first session, that may get a client motivated to come back and to actually engage in therapy. So we've done some neuroscience work as the basis of our approach. So the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion is something you might have learned in social psychology if you've taken such a course. And there's two types of processing. One is peripheral processing, where there is low message engagement and there's a low likelihood of attitude change. Central processing involves high message engagement, a high likelihood of attitude change. And when central processing occurs, there's neural activation in the attention and self-processing networks of the brain. So if you think about internet content, if you're on social media and you get an ad about clothing and you're looking for clothing, that's going to activate central processing. On the other hand, if you're looking for clothing and you see an ad for a retirement home, unless you're looking to retire, if you're looking for clothing and you see an ad for a retirement home, you're going to just dismiss that. So the goal of therapy is to engage central processing, getting a person's attention, giving them a message that's going to be highly persuasive. Neural activation increases in the cell processing networks, including the medial, prefrontal, and posterior cingulate cortices that's implicated in the processing of persuasive messages. So there's actual areas of the brain that are activated when these persuasive messages are presented. And so in our work, we wanted to study neural response to different types of psychotherapy. What types of psychotherapy are going to be most relevant or most engaging to Asian Americans? And so we decided to compare the personal relevance of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the mainstream approach to therapy, versus problem-solving therapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy focuses on thoughts and feelings, but there's a lot of face loss potential. There's a focus on the self. There's not as much of a focus on the context or problem solving. The problem is located within the self, whereas problem solving therapy focuses on goal setting and external problem solving. So there's potential to save face. Problem solving therapy may be personally relevant to many Asian Americans, especially those who are unacculturated, because you can actually accomplish something. So therapy for many Asian Americans, particularly those who are less acculturated, may be something that's kind of mysterious, whereas solving actual problems is something that can be relevant to just about anybody. So our hypothesis was that the personal relevance of problem-solving therapy would be greater than cognitive behavioral therapy for Asian Americans. And again, external problem-solving allows a person to save face by focusing on family, school, and work issues. And there's less emphasis on the self. And again, external problem-solving can provide an immediate gift, something that's immediately practical. So we did a proof of concept study with 28 Asian Americans, first, second, and third generation. And we randomly ordered excerpts from CBT or PST treatment manuals, and we presented these in an fMRI scanner. Some of you have been in MRI machines. fMRI is a brain scan while a person is doing an activity. So it's brain imaging while a person is engaged in a particular task. And this was one of the excerpts on CBT. When we look at your thoughts, sometimes they're true, not true, have a grain of truth. We'll teach you to evaluate the accuracy of your thoughts by looking at the evidence. What evidence is there that the thought is true? What evidence is there that the thought is not true? Problem-solving therapy is an example, or an excerpt is one skill that may help you is a generation of alternatives, in which we teach you to use your creative skills to brainstorm different types of solutions. You will come up with as many solutions as you can. Not all will be the best solution, but it helps you think of alternatives. For example, if you are struggling to talk to your roommate about cleaning up after themselves, you can use the brainstorming tool to discover that there are many ways to get closer to your goal and get past the obstacles in your way. So let's see, CBT and PST. So it probably takes you a bit to digest the two. Back to CBT. Just give me a show of hands. How many of you would see CBT as the more preferable of the two? Thinking about your thought processes, accuracy of your thought. So how many of you would see CBT as more practical, okay, or useful? How about problem-solving therapy? How many would choose that, and others are choosing anything, or maybe they're equal? How many would say one's as good as the other? Okay, so a bunch of people didn't vote. All right. Okay. So anyway, what we found, this is a series of brain scans, and what it shows is that in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, an area that is associated with central processing, there was much more central processing amongst these 28 Asian Americans in response to problem-solving therapy than to cognitive behavioral therapy. And these participants didn't know which was which. Their brains responded to problem-solving therapy more than to cognitive behavioral therapy. This is by generation. What you see on the left is that for first and second generation Asian Americans, this difference was even more pronounced. For less acculturated people, a focus on practical problem solving was much more relevant in terms of brain response than cognitive behavioral therapy. So the question is, okay, well, maybe you only studied Asian Americans, and we didn't have enough money to study do more brain scans. But the question is, maybe everybody likes problem solving therapy more than CBT. And so we looked at, did a self-report study of college students looking at personal relevance, liking, and helpfulness. And for European Americans, problem-solving therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy were essentially the same. Problem-solving therapy was preferred a little bit more, but these are not significant differences. If you look at Asian Americans, there was a clear preference for problem-solving therapy. So it appears that this preference for problem-solving therapy is specific to Asian Americans. So the summary of the studies is that neural activation self-report suggested that a pragmatic approach was more relevant to Asian Americans than a self-focused approach, cognitive behavioral therapy. And this neural response to problem-solving therapy was more pronounced for immigrants and their children. And the self-report indicates that problem-solving therapy preference was specific to Asian Americans. So now I want to talk a bit about this MindBoba app. I'm going to move through this a little bit. So this is an app to address stress among Asian Americans. Art and Chris Nezu helped us develop this. The advantage of an app is that it's widely accessible. It reduces stigma and saves face. In other words, the person doesn't have to go in and see an actual therapist or publicly acknowledge that they have mental health issues. We have an Asian American context in terms of characters and a panda, which I'll show you in a bit. And there's a focus on practical problems. And there's homework that results in accomplishments and progress. So it's focused on aspects of therapy that might be relevant to Asian Americans. So MindBoba is the app. This is, welcome to MindBoba. It's like you're in a boba shop. This panda's with you. There's the panda that comes around with you drinking boba, and there's these three people that are Asian Americans, and they are going through different experiences. Shows that Asian Americans can have mental health problems. They can address them. And then this is one of the modules. There's different missions. There's a solution mission, brain boosters, motivation, emotion explorers. So a person has a menu and they can select a problem, come up with different solutions to the problem, try those solutions, see if they work, and if they don't work, try something else. If they do work, continue those approaches. So set goals, brainstorm solutions, create the plan, reflect, and there's the panda with the boba helping you through. So mindboba.com is the website. We're actually doing a randomized clinical trial, so we're recruiting Chinese Americans, Chinese Canadians count too. And you can scan this, or it's mindboba.com, and anyone can participate. You get the intervention as well as $120 for doing the assessments. You can use your $120 to go buy some boba, I guess. Lots of it. So conclusions, Asian Americans continue to be the least likely group to use mental health services. Asian Americans are diverse. So some Asian Americans are going to benefit from cognitive therapy. Maybe they took a course in college in psychopathology, or maybe they've gone to graduate school and studied psychology and may see cognitive therapy for them. But for many Asian Americans, a personally relevant therapy that addresses practical problems that might be attractive to many Asian Americans. And with our app, we're hoping to bring people into therapy that wouldn't otherwise come to therapy. And also, the app is not intended as a substitute for actual therapists. The app is intended to engage people in therapy. For some people, the app is going to be enough, but for others, they may become enthusiastic about therapy and see an actual therapist as a result of getting engaged with the app.